So first, again, just thanks for taking the time to do this. This is for the audience. We are Lisa Feldman Barrett and Mark Solms, two scientists who have very different views on the nature of emotion and also on the validity of knowledge claims that scientists make in the science of emotion. And so for context, for anyone who's listening, this conversation came about because Mark tweeted that he was writing a critique of my work called, for the moment anyways, The Theory of Constructed Emotion. And so I responded by inviting Mark to discuss his understanding of the theory first, so his critique could be as accurate and useful as possible. And so here we are. In the meantime, I think Mark has some questions for me about my understanding of Jaak Panksepp's work. And so we'll talk about those as well. We're going to release the video of our discussion unedited. And I just want to also mention that it's really rare for two scientists to speak to each other in advance of a critique like this. And I would also say it's very rare for scientists who disagree with each other to talk to each other at all sometimes. We're hoping that this discussion will serve as a model of for others who want to critique each other's work or who just hold different views. So that's my opening. Do you have anything you want to add?
No, I agree with every word so far.
Well, okay. I'm assuming that despite our best efforts, that might be it for our our agreement, but we'll see. So I thought we could start with your understanding of the theory of constructed emotion, and then some of your critiques, and we'll spend about the first 45 minutes talking about those, and then we can, if it doesn't come up, we can switch to your concerns about my understanding of basic emotion theory or Jaak's view in particular, or anything else actually that you have questions about. Does that make sense?
Yes, so we'll begin with me giving you my understanding of the constructed emotion theory. And then you'll tell me what I've got wrong, if anything. Then I'm going to ask you some questions about that theory, and that we think will take about half of our time. Then after that, I'm going to ask you some further questions about your understanding of Jaak Panksepp's basic emotion theory.
Correct.
Is that correct?
That is correct.
Okay.
Mm-hmm. So take it away, Mark.
Okay, well, I've made some notes because I want to quote some passages. For simplicity's sake, I've kept all the quotes, limited them to your book, How Emotions Are Made. So where I give page references, it's to that book. So if you'll let me just go through the summary as a whole first, Lisa, because I think it is of a piece. And then I'll pause for you to tell me where I've misunderstood or misrepresented things.
Great.
So I think that Lisa's view, that is the theory of constructed emotions, unfolds over 5 basic points. And I'll enumerate those as I go along. The first point, which concerns what she calls the body budget, is the following. Interoceptive sensations arising from the regulation of the body budget, which I take to mean homeostatic demands. These sensations arising from the regulation of the body budget generate interoceptive sensations. So Lisa says on page 57 of her book, quote, interoception is the origin of feeling, unquote. But importantly, Lisa says that interoceptive sensations are not felt as discrete categories of affective qualia. So she says on page 103 of the book, quotes, the emotional information is not in the signal itself. So that's the first point concerning the body budget. I now move on to the second point, which concerns Lisa's definition of affect. She says that the brain generates, quotes, simple summaries of your budgetary state. That's on page 72. And that these summaries are felt in two qualitative dimensions only, namely valence and arousal. This is what you, Lisa, call affect. Affect is this simple summary, which is felt as valence and arousal alone. You say on page 82, quote, affect is your brain's best guess about the state of your body budget, unquote. So that's the second point. It's got to do with the definition of affect. Then here comes the third point. It concerns your definition of emotion as opposed to affect. What Lisa calls emotion, in contrast to affect, entails your brain, quotes, giving meaning to the interoceptive sensory summaries. This meaning is acquired on the basis of past experiences of these sensory summaries in various exteroceptive contexts. These meanings, which Lisa calls emotion concepts, are therefore entirely learnt. They are not innate essences. So, for example, your parents might perceive your response to a disquieting situation and say to you, you are scared. And on this basis, you'll construct a concept called fear. Then, the next time you find yourself in a similar situation, you'll infer that you're in a state of fear. Emotions are therefore socially constructed, not innate natural kinds. That's why some cultures do not feel fear in the way that we do. For example, the Kum of the Kalahari Desert don't feel fear because they don't have a word for fear, which has the same denotation as our word, fear. Then comes the fourth point, which concerns the relationship between emotions and cognitions. On this basis, Lisa claims that, quote, emotions are not in principle distinct from cognitions and perceptions. That's on page 34. Accordingly, Lisa, you write on page 134, and I quote, we construct instances of emotion in exactly the same manner as money. The concept, for example, fear, imposes new functions on these sensations, creating reality where there was none before, an experience or perception of emotion. End of quote. Likewise, on page 141, you write, quote, without a concept of fear, you cannot experience fear. And this leads to the fifth and last point in my summary of Lisa's view. These learned concepts determine what we do to meet our body budgetary demands. That is, they trigger predictions as to what we must do in order to attain our preferred states, just as exteroceptive conceptual inferences do on the active inference account of perception and action. So that's my best effort at summarizing your view, Lisa. And I look forward to hearing from you now whether I've got anything wrong or whether I've left anything out.
Thank you. That was great. I would say that you got some things pretty close, but I think that there are some nuances maybe that are worth mentioning. And I maybe even before I start that, I will say you're quoting from a book that is a popular science book. And popular science books, as you know, Mark, are not the same thing as the scientific research that supports those books. And what I mean by that is we use metaphors in, we try not to use metaphors in science, but we certainly use metaphors in popular science writing to try to communicate things. And as you know, all metaphors are wrong. And what we do in science writing is we try to pick the metaphor that's least wrong for our purposes, that does the least violence or that impacts the validity of the statements the least, the smallest amount that we can manage. So I appreciate you taking the time to read the book carefully, but there are certain things I wouldn't say as a scientist when I'm talking to other scientists like you. I would never use the word body budget, for example. That's a metaphor. I mean, the brain isn't literally running a budget in the way that you run a budget for your finances, for example, but it's a really decent metaphor. It's also wrong in certain ways, but for the purposes of explaining allostasis, not homeostasis, by the way, I'm not saying homeostasis is irrelevant as a concept. I'm saying allostasis in the way that Peter Sterling talks about it. Actually, it was really his concept. It's his version of the concept, I think, which makes the most sense from my perspective, from a scientific standpoint. I would prefer to refer to allostasis as opposed to body budgeting because that's a metaphor. And I would also say that some of the words that you're using, I probably define in different ways than you do. And so I think that's maybe where places where we disagree. So let's start with allostasis and interoception. Your statement about my claim that interoception is the origin of feeling is more or less correct. So from an evolutionary standpoint, this is something that, I covered in my second popular science book, and that I'm actually writing about more in a scientific domain, if you will, that brains evolved, it seems, evolved in concert with the growth of the size and complexity of bodies. And one of their most important jobs is regulating the state of the body, modeling the state of the body and regulating the state of the body. And the most metabolically efficient way to do that is predictively. So the brain is always regulating the body and coordinating all the systems, and the body is sending signals back to the brain, which the brain uses to confirm or correct its model of the current sensory state of the body. And that's what we call interoception. So there I'm citing that kind of a statement is not based on my own work only, it's based on a lot of other people's work. Hugo Critchley, a lot of other people who've done very important work in that regard. And interoception, we are not particularly wired to have very precise sensations of interoceptive events in the body. And we could talk about examples of that, but when you have appendicitis, for example, you feel a general dull ache in your abdomen. You don't feel a precise pain, sharp pain where your appendix is until right before the appendix it bursts. So there's not, and actually you can even look at we just finished a review of the vagus nerve, the anatomy of the vagus nerve, and which is one of the most important nerves for bringing interoceptive cues to the body. And it's not a complete, it's not like there's an absence of any spatial or temporal organization. It's just it looks much less precise than something like your optic nerve, it looks actually more like the way olfaction works, which is there's some information there, but it's not so precise that you're feeling specific things in specific places. And we know from a lot of research that what I call affect, which are basic properties of consciousness, and I'm defining affect, and this is getting to your second point now, I'm defining affect in the way that Wundt described affect, which is as properties of consciousness. So just like brightness and loudness are properties of consciousness, affect is also properties of consciousness. So feeling, you know, pleasant or unpleasant, comfortable, uncomfortable, worked up or calm. And these are what we would call lower dimensional or compressed summaries of the interoceptive details that the brain is receiving. So the idea that affect is valence and arousal alone, I don't think I ever said that. I mean, I'll have to go back and check your quote of my book, but I never said, I might have said valence and arousal and left other features of affect unspecified, but I don't think I've ever said that it's only valence and arousal, because the data don't support that view. There are other features of affect, like a feeling of effort. So there are other descriptive features to affect other than just valence and arousal. But, you know, I think what you're referencing there, and I could be wrong here, but I think what you're referencing here is that Jaak, Panksepp, and you, and some other people you're using a definition of affect, which is different from mine. And my definition is from Wundt, and your definition is more, you're using affect to refer to anything with a feeling involved. So sometimes people use the word affect to mean anything emotional whatsoever, like it's the domain of emotion is affect. And then you can have specific affects in this vocabulary, like angry or sad or what have you. And so these two definitions, there's no, they're stipulated definitions. I'm stipulating the definition of affect as a property of consciousness based on a whole body of research. And you're stipulating yours on the basis of other research. And so this is what Thomas Kuhn would call incommensurability. And I'm actually saying this for our listeners now. So listeners, this is a sort of background for you. When there are two paradigms that parse the scientific pie differently, if you will, sometimes the vocabularies can be incommensurate. The example would be, Mark, if you were referring to a table as an Excel spreadsheet and I was referring to a table as a literal piece of furniture, you and I would have problems talking about tables because we're not really talking about the same thing. Or for example, I work with some engineers, and it took us 2 years to realize that their use of the word state is very different than what a psychologist or a neuroscientist how they would define that term. So the definitions were incommensurate. And so what we ended up having to do was kind of use modifiers. So I think that's what you and I should do. When we're talking about affect, we can talk about the Wundtian definition of affect, the Wundtian affect, or we could talk about the Pankseppian affect, or we could call it whatever you want. But there are two definitions of affect here. One is that it's a property of consciousness that has features, general features, like valence and arousal and effort and some other things, although most of the empirical evidence is most robust for valence and arousal. So that's what I tend to focus on. But my failure to mention other general features doesn't mean I don't think they're relevant. It's just they're not part of this discussion because, you know, when you write a book, you have to limit what you talk about. Otherwise, your book will be 1 million pages long. Whereas you're talking about affect in the way that Panksepp meant it, which is that there are specific qualia for anger, sadness, fear, and so on. That's my understanding. Your third point about emotion concepts being learned and socially constructed, I would say, I'm definitely saying they're not innate natural kinds. There are specific philosophical definitions for what a natural kind is. Of course, there's more than one because, you know, nobody can agree on the definition of anything. So there's more than one, but there are definable criteria for natural kind categories. And I don't think emotions meet those criteria under by anybody's research, actually. That being said, I think it's a little bit of a misnomer to say that I think that emotions are socially constructed, because actually the theory of constructed emotion is a constructionist view that certainly has elements of social construction, but it also has elements of psychological construction and neural construction. So the way that I understand, for example, how emotion concepts are learned is by cultural inheritance, which is a neural process. Of course, it's also a social process, but basically by virtue of the actions and words and so on that adult caregivers expose their infants to, the infant's brain is wired according to, brains wire themselves to their world, and the world is curated for infants by their caregivers. So there's a whole sort of, you know, evolutionary developmental neuroscience base to the social construction, if as you would call it, and other people have called it. So I think that's, you know, some people have looked at the theory of constructed emotion and said, well, this is actually a set of neural hypotheses for how social construction actually occurs. And I think that's probably an accurate characterization. But I also think that in order to understand what I mean by a concept, you have to really understand what I mean when I'm talking about the neural construction piece. And so again, this is more for listeners who probably haven't read the book than for you, Mark, because you're probably familiar with this idea. But, you know, the brain is receiving signals all the time from the sensory surfaces of its body. So your brain is receiving sensory signals all the time from your retina, from your cochlea, from the glucose receptors in your muscles, and so on and so forth. You have sensory surfaces, they're always sending sense data, sensory signals to the brain. The brain has to, you know, act on those signals to keep itself alive and well. But it doesn't know what the causes of the signals are. It only knows the signals, which are the outcomes of some causes. And this means the brain has to guess at what the causes are. And those guesses, I'm not saying that you said in your point 5 that I claim that concepts trigger predictions, but that's actually not the hypothesis. Here's the hypothesis. Your brain is receiving signals, and it has to know what to do about those signals so that it knows how to stay alive. And the signals are outcomes of some set of causes in the brain and in the body and in the world, and the brain doesn't know what they are. So it has to guess. And the only source of information it can use to guess is past experience. Now, that past experience is either is hard-coded into those neurons from, you know, by genes, or it comes from learned experience. It's one or the other. And what I would say is that we have the kind of genes that set up the brain in such a way that we're constantly learning concepts. And so the general idea is this: metaphorically, the brain is what it's doing is it's attempting to generate past experiences that are equivalent in some way, similar in some way to the pattern of sense data. And in psychology, a group of things which are similar to each other is a category. And a representation of a category is a concept. So what you can say is that the brain is continuously generating categories or concepts, and it's doing this predictively. And it's doing it predictively for all the reasons that, predictive processing models suggest. So basically, predictions are concepts. Concepts don't trigger predictions. Predictions are concepts. They're groups of concepts. Concepts are groups of predictions that are similar to each other in some way. They can be similar to each other in terms of the low-level sensory motor features. They could be similar, those signals that we were talking about, they could be similar to each other in terms of the more compressed summary signals like affect or reward or threat, or any of the features that the brain can compute based on its architecture, which I haven't talked about in this conversation, but is certainly in the book. So the idea is that this is how the brain makes sense of all sensory signals from the world and from the body. It's generating concepts using features that it deems as equivalent, so that you can say, well, these past experiences were similar to this. In the past, I did these things in response to these signals. And so in the present, there's some probability that these things will work. And that doesn't mean that there aren't hard-coded behavioral or hard-coded sort of actions that exist in the brain. But the way that a brain generates a concept, if you just look at the architecture of the brain, the way it generates a concept or category is it starts with these what we would call abstract features, or features that can refer to multiple sensory motor patterns. So if you think about, for example, even something like a motor concept, like, reaching out to grab a glass, for example, that is the idea of reaching to grab a glass is an abstract, what's considered an abstract concept, because there are multiple motor movements that you could make to grab that concept, to sort of enact that concept, to grab the glass. And there are different patterns of interoceptive and somatosensory cues that result. So the idea is that there are these abstractions, these abstract features that are decompressed in the brain. So for example, for motor control, they're decompressed down through the brainstem to the spinal cord. And it's really at the spinal cord that things become very, very specific. So what if your action concept is not to reach, but to run? The circuitry in the midbrain and the brainstem don't specifically tell any brain of any body in a vertebrate, well, I shouldn't say any vertebrate, like we're not talking about larval zebrafish or whatever, but like let's just say in a mammalian brain, that's a phrase that Jaak likes to use, that the concept to run is even in the brainstem is not a specific set of actions, specific muscle movements. That happens at the spinal cord. That's what the evidence suggests. Same thing for vision. When the brain is making, as part of a concept, it's making predictions, signals for vision. Those have to be decompressed into very specific signals that that V1 would predict, or that V1, their predictions for V1 about what V1 will receive from the world. So my point here, and all of this, of course, is happening really, really quickly and without your awareness. So and without your volition for the most part. So I guess my point here is that that concepts don't trigger predictions. They are predictions. Predictions are not, abstract ideas. They're your brain literally changing the firing of its own neurons to prepare motor actions and to receive sense signals that are the consequences of those actions. What the brain is doing is it's attempting to, what a category is good for, or a concept is good for, is induction. It means that when you have a new instance of something and you don't know what it is, you can, if you categorize it with a concept, you can make inferences about other features of that instance that you don't, that you expect. So the idea is the following. If I, let me say it simply, and then I'll say it about emotion. So there are these experiments with babies where they take 4-month-olds and they show an object to a 4-month-old and they say, this is a blick. Okay, look, honey, this is a blick. And they put the blick down and the blick makes a beep. And then they take another object, which doesn't look anything the same, doesn't smell the same, doesn't feel the same. And they say, look, honey, this is a blick. And they put the blick down and the blick beeps. And then they take a third object and they say, look, honey, this is a blick. Blick is a word that stands in for a bunch of features. That's what a category is. And that's what a concept, that's what a word is. It refers to a collection of features of a concept. And so when you say this is a blick to a baby, even a baby who is pre-verbal, the baby knows to predict, it's learned to predict that this is going to beep because you've categorized it for the baby, and the baby can use that categorization to make an induction about what the other features of this are. So the idea is that this is actually how brains learn to use categories and concepts. If you, in your life, in fear, for example, you probably have done many things in fear. You've probably seen people do many things in fear. The sensory motor patterns are different, but they're all fear. And the fact that you've categorized something as fear means that when you see a new instance that you categorize as fear, you can make all sorts of inductive inferences about what you need to do in that situation and what it might feel like and what might happen next. So the idea is not that a word is necessary for fear. You don't need the word fear to categorize fear, to create an instance of fear, to feel fear, but that you need the concept. And I will just say that you quoted something that I said about the Kung and, you need a word. And that was a meaningful statement in that context. But elsewhere in the book, I have made it really perfectly and utterly clear that you don't need a word to have a concept, but you do need to have, your brain has to be able to make the concept in order to have the experience. So in chapter 5, beginning on page 104, I wrote, you need not explicitly recall or speak an emotion word to construct an instance of emotion. In fact, you can experience and perceive an emotion even if you don't have a word for it. Most of us who speak English were able to enjoy someone else's misfortune long before the word schadenfreude entered our language. All you needed is a concept. How did you get a concept without the word? Well, your brain's conceptual system has a special power called conceptual combination. And then this was again discussed in chapter 7, starting on page 141. So the idea is that you have to be able, your brain has to be able to make a concept. It has to be able to say, this set of sensory signals is similar to some other sensory signals from the past. And that is that allows you to infer something about what these signals mean, meaning what you need to do about those signals, and how you might feel about those signals. And the word isn't necessary. It's just that words are super useful ways to learn abstract concepts, to learn concepts where the instances might differ in their sensory and motor features. What you see might differ, what you feel might differ, what the qualia might differ, but they have some functional similarity to each other. That's the idea. So it's a bit of a straw man to say that that a word is necessary. The sentence that you read, I did write, of course, but it was in a larger context where this was being discussed. And of course, all of this is happening outside of awareness. And so the last thing I'll just say is this. I'm not saying, I don't really know what an instinct is, but I'll just say it differently. I'm not saying that behavioral reflexes don't exist. They clearly do exist. For example, in a larval zebrafish, which is 2 hours old, it has defensive reflexes. But even in a 2 hour old larval zebrafish, those reflexes are not executed in an obligatory punctate way. Reflexes, by which I would understand to be associated with instincts, even in that little animal, which has no learning yet, the reflexes are executed in a contextually sensitive way. And so I guess what I'm saying is that part of what concepts do is they choose which reflexes, if you will, which behavioral programs, which actions are the best ones to use for that category in that instance, which is why in fear, sometimes you run away, sometimes you freeze, sometimes you fight, sometimes you cry. In Bali, people fall asleep. There's no specific sensory motor pattern for an abstract concept, which is what I think emotions are. So I've just blathered on for a long time. So I'm going to stop now. I'll let you ask questions or disagree or make comments or whatever.
Thanks, Lisa. Well, you may be surprised to hear that just about everything you said, I have no problem with. So you said at the outset, perhaps the only thing we'll agree on is that it's a good idea to have such a conversation. I think we are seeing the yield of having such a conversation is that you find that there's more agreement than you might otherwise have thought. So let me first of all just say something about our time frame. We had agreed that I would present to you a summary of your views. You would correct them where I got them wrong, which you've just done, and that then I would ask you questions about your views, and that all of that would take 45 minutes. We have already taken 40 minutes.
Yeah.
So the second half of our time was meant to be given to me asking you questions about your understanding and possible misunderstanding of the basic emotion theory that I endorse, which is fundamentally rooted in Jaak Panksepp's work. I'm not sure that we'll be able to get to that because, you know, time is fleeting. So let's do what we can without rushing it, and if needs be, and if you want to, we can have a
we can definitely meet again.
Yeah.
I think the other possibility, I like that idea. The other possibility is that you can go away and think about. We can meet again for sure, but you can think about the things I've said to formulate your questions, and we can switch to your questions now about Jaak's work. And I can try to answer those. And then, you know, basically we can just sort of get our positions on the table, and then we can go away and think about it a little bit and then come back.
I think I'd like to say some things immediately in response to what you've just said, which I think will clarify both of those aspects, both my questions of your own views and my questions about your understanding of my school of thought. But I think let's just plod on. Okay. And then, if we run out of time, that's fine. We can schedule another meeting, and depending on where we got up to, we can both cogitate on, percolate what has been said in this meeting and continue with what was originally planned. So let me just begin by saying I absolutely take your point about metaphors. I know I'm very alert to the fact that the book I'm quoting from is popular science. So you are forgiven your use of metaphor. And if in what follows, I quote those metaphors again, I can only ask our listeners or viewers to bear in mind what you said, that they're simplistic metaphors trying to convey to a non-specialist audience ideas which are best conveyed that way. We won't hold that against you. I think, though, a really important thing that you said was when you said that you do not define affect as being constituted solely by valence and arousal. I think that changes a great deal. Let me quickly say what I think an affect is, and I will link that then to Yark's view. And I think that the point you made, we just have to be very clear with everyone that, different people define affect differently. So the best we can do is to spell out what we mean by the term. So for me, an affect, and I'm speaking for myself now, not for Yark Panksepp, for me, an affect, in addition to the fundamental intrinsic property of valence, which is absolutely fundamental to affect, that there's a goodness and badness, a pleasure and displeasure to affect. And I think that that's what sets affect apart from it, because it's intrinsic to affect. It's what sets it apart from perception and cognition. The percepts and cognitions are not intrinsically valenced, but affect is. Arousal, I have no disagreement there. But for me, a third fundamental property of affect is that it has a distinctive quality, that there are categories of affect. I'm going to move on to what you just said about categories in a moment, but let me begin here. There are categories of affect which are innate givens. So, for example, it's intrinsic to affect that not only there is an unpleasure and an arousal that's associated with, let's say, pain, but that the quality of pain is distinctive. It's different from the quality of disgust, from the quality of thirst, from the quality of sleepiness. And I think that these are fundamental properties of affect. In other words,
can I stop you there? I just want to clarify some differences in our opinion here. So just before you go on, so we don't have to discuss them. I just want to kind of mark them. So I would say you said something important, which is that the goodness and badness, the valence property of affect, sets it apart from cognition and perception. And there I would disagree with you, because I think that in the Wundtian sense, that affect is a property of consciousness, meaning your brain is always regulating your body. Your body is always sending sense data back to your brain. So you are always in a state where affect is relevant to consciousness. Sometimes it's in the foreground and sometimes it's in the background, but it's always there in cognition and in perception. So I would say that unlike you and many other psychologists, I'll say, who, like Jerry Clore, for example, We agree on many things, but one thing we don't agree on is, you know, he thinks about affect as setting the boundary between cognition and perception on one hand and emotion on the other. And I disagree with that. And I disagree not as a matter of opinion, but on the basis of data. So that's one place I think where we disagree. And this is one place where people really get me wrong, actually, because they think I'm making very strong distinctions between emotion and cognition and that the two interact in some way or whatever. And I'm not saying that at all. I think the other thing I'll say is that you're suggesting that there are very specific qualities of experience for pain versus disgust versus sleepiness and so on, versus fear versus anger. And I would question that. And the reason why I would question that is, I'm not saying they're identical in any way, but I don't think there's one qualia for disgust. For example, there are instances of disgust where people are feeling very pleasant. And there are instances where they feel unpleasant. Same thing for fear. There are instances of pleasant fear. There are instances of unpleasant fear. Same thing for anger. These are all documented in the literature. So for humans, so because, you know, you can study experiences in humans. So my point is that it's not that everything is the same. It's that there's variation, I would say, within a category. And there's also similarity across categories, which means the boundaries aren't firm. I'm not trying to argue with you right now. I'm just sort of saying that these are two places where I think we might disagree. Well, we do disagree on our hypotheses and probably on the literature that we would draw on to justify them.
Right. So to go back to what I was saying, I will pick up on some of the points you've just made now in what I was going to say next. But to go back to what I was saying, I do think that affect is different from perception and cognition. I think that there are fundamental, and I say fundamental in the sense of, in the developmental sense. In other words, one starts with fundamental categories of affect. I think what you've just been talking about is how these categories become elaborated through development, including through socialization, but of course not limited to that, how they become elaborated through learning from experience. But I believe that the qualia that attach to perception and cognition, in the sense that I distinguish them from affect, are the qualia of our extraceptive, the qualia of vision and hearing and somatic sensation and olfaction and taste. The qualia of affect are much more tied to specific survival imperatives. So things like hunger and sleep and nociception and the like. So that's why they exist. They exist so that we know in what way are things going badly. It's not just that things are going badly. It's that in terms of my viable bounds, I'm moving out of my viable bounds. The unpleasant affect, the unpleasant valence predicts my demise if I carry on down this path. But it makes absolute evolutionary sense that you need to know in which category things are going wrong. In other words, it wouldn't help to sleep if you're in pain, or to withdraw your finger if you're thirsty. You know, there's specific sorts of. Just let me try to elaborate a little bit of what I'm saying, because it's very difficult for me to get my points across otherwise. I take it. I mean, I fully appreciate that you will need to respond, but if you keep responding while I'm speaking, then I can't actually get my stall set out. So I think that you mentioned appendicitis. I fully grant you that the pain is poorly located spatially, but nevertheless it is pain. and we all feel it as pain. And I put it to you that not only do humans feel it as pain, anybody with an appendix, any creature with an appendix in appendicitis will feel pain, and not sleepiness, thirst, disgust, etc. And that attached to those innate categories of affect. Remember, I'm claiming that affects have innate categorical qualia at the beginning. I don't deny that they then become elaborated and symbolized and become amorphous in all sorts of ways and idiosyncratic in all sorts of ways. But I'm saying from the beginning, a baby feels pain when its nociceptors are stimulated, and that has a quality, and the category that you refer to is innate. It's given by natural selection. And there's obvious reasons why one would not rely on learning for that, which is why it's very important what you've just clarified in your first response to what I've said, when you clarified that there are innate categories, that categories are not only learnt. I believe that those innate categories then are elaborated through learning. Now we come to the importance of this property of consciousness called affect. The reason that we feel the affect, you correctly pointed out that we have innate predictions. You didn't quite put it that way, but I think that's basically what you were saying when you say we have reflexes and instincts. There are, and by the way, they're not all at the level of the spinal cord, of course. We have for example, affective attack, freezing, fleeing, and so on. These things are not, they're not orchestrated at the level of the spinal cord. They're orchestrated at higher brainstem levels, but that's neither here nor there. The important thing is we do have innate ways of dealing with those survival imperatives. The demand is made, something needs to be done. That's what the unpleasant valence means. Something needs to be done about a particular category of need. That's what the quality means. And the reason that it is felt is that precisely as, again, I think you were saying, the reflexes and instincts are context insensitive. They're not sufficiently nuanced. They're too generalized, spatially and temporally, to really fit the bill. And this is why one has to learn from experience what else to do, which is why there's this variety that you talk about. What else to do, when else to respond in this way, how else to respond, how to respond in situations where there are competing needs, and so on. This is where all of that cognitive work that you talk of is absolutely essential. And I've never denied that, and Jaak has never denied that. That's what he calls secondary process, as opposed to the primary process affect. They're these secondary processes which have to do with learning. Now, I come back again to why we have a feeling, a conscious feeling at all. It is to tell us whether what we're doing is working or not. So if it were just reflex and instinct, there would be no place for feeling. It wouldn't be contributing anything. The feeling tells the subject, yes, this is working. No, this is not working. Take, for example, suffocation alarm. You're in a carbon dioxide filled room. You've no way of knowing which way to turn. And so you feel your way through the problem. The air hunger gets better or worse, depending on the success or failure of your actions. So I'm saying all of this in order to make clear why I think that not only arousal and valence, but also qualitatively distinct categories tied to innate predictions, which are, as you say, innate concepts, innate models of the world, why this is all there from the get-go. My understanding was that you always disagreed with that. So if you do not disagree with that, I think we're going to have a great difficulty finding anything substantial to disagree about. Because to me, sorry, Lisa, I'm very nearly finished with what I wanted to say.
Yeah, I thought you were finished. Remember, I said that there were delays, right? So
yeah, no worries, no worries. Oh gosh, in any event, now I've lost the point that I was going to make. So yes, it was this. It's that if you agree and I'm not saying you do, I mean, this is probably the most important thing that we can clarify now, that there are innate categories of affect, which have not only innate concepts in the form of innate predictions, but also innate qualia, which are qualitatively distinct from each other. In other words, they're categorical. They are categorical variables. That is to say, qualitative. So valence is a continuous variable, and then these categories, which are felt in these different types of these different qualities of affect. If you accept that such things exist, then the distinction between affect and emotion becomes, because you use those words very differently. Affect is quite a different concept for you than emotion is. And in Jacques' taxonomy, the broad concept is affect. In other words, valenced qualities of feeling. And then there are bodily affects, of which there are two types, extraceptive and intraceptive. By the way, I don't agree that affects are all intraceptive at all. Like, for example, pain when you prick your finger, nothing intraceptive about it. And then there are emotional affects. So the broad concept is affect, and then it's divided into bodily versus emotional ones. And the distinction between bodily affects and emotional affects is a gray one. But the way that I understood you to be setting out your theory before, and that's why I'm saying again, I really look forward eagerly to hearing your response now, is that if affect does include a qualitatively distinct feelings tied to different categories of survival imperative, then I think that the difference between your view and the basic emotion view really pales, it sort of fades away into an argument about words. So can you clarify that if you're saying that affect does not only consist in valence and arousal, then the question is, what else does it consist in? You said things like effort. You clearly mentioned pain under the rubric of affect. And would you then accept that there are various qualities of affect that are there from the beginning before they're elaborated through the process of learning from experience?
Thank you. So what I said was that I do think that newborns have knowledge before they have some what we would call innate. I think some like Susan Carey, for example, calls them innate concepts or core concepts or something like that. I'm very agnostic about that. I think, for example, affect valence is innate, probably. I don't think you have to teach an infant what is pleasant and what is unpleasant. So, but I don't think that anger, sadness, fear, and so on constitute categories, distinct categories of affect in the way that you mean them. I don't think the evidence supports that claim. So I do think that some knowledge is inborn, but I don't think it's discrete categories for emotion or for affect. I don't think they meet that. I don't think there are very many categories that are innate, but I do leave open the possibility that there are some, like pleasant, unpleasant it's not really a category, although you have to make it into a category in order to act on it.
No, but that's valence. I'm asking, in addition to valence and arousal, what else would affect consist in?
Well, affect is a property, as I understand it, affect is a property of consciousness. So the intent, so arousal is a property, the intensity of the feeling is a property, feeling of effort is a property. But affect is, because it's continuous, always, every moment of your waking life, you are experiencing affect, whether you're perceiving something in the world or whether you're having a thought or a belief or whatever. Affect is always there. And I would say, at least that's what the evidence suggests. So you seem to be saying, and I'm just going to sort of pick these off in the order in which, I wrote them down. You seem to be suggesting that affect is different from cognition and perception because cognition and perception are only exteroceptive, but affect maybe with the, well, okay, then I misunderstood you, but there is evidence, right? I guess I would wonder how you would think about evidence that interoception actually is intrinsically important to perception, to literally, there are studies showing that interoceptive cues influence the brain, sensory sampling of vision, for example, of visual inputs, for example. So I don't, based on my understanding of the anatomy and also on the functional dynamics in the brain, I don't think you could even make a very strong claim about there being separate interoceptive and exteroceptive processing. I mean, the sensory surfaces are okay. So what is your distinction then between cognition and affect? If affect is, where do you think the source of affect is exactly? That if there's something different between the two, that it's categorical, what is it?
It is our innate needs, by which I mean the various homeostats that represent our viable bounds. So we have multiple such homeostats, and they, by the way, do not by any means only pertain to interoceptive data. So I'm fully in agreement with you there. For example, a 6-month-old infant, you were referring earlier to 4-month-old, you were teaching these artificial concepts to.
It wasn't me. That brilliant work is by Sandy Waxman and other male psychologists.
No, it doesn't matter who did it.
I wish it was work I had done, but it wasn't me. Yeah.
But a 6-month-old infant responds with a startle response to snakes and spiders. So those are extraceptive stimuli. It's clearly that's an innate prediction that this thing requires more of an arousal response than say
but I would suggest that you maybe go look at the work of Karen Adolphs and Vanessa Lobu, because they've really challenged the idea that that snakes and spiders and other stimuli that are supposed to evoke fear are actually evoking fear.
No, I didn't say fear. I said that there is a arousal response which is differential. I'm trying to make the point.
Sure, but an arousal response that's differential doesn't mean, right? So, okay, there's an arousal. I mean, anytime something is novel, there's an arousal response. So
yeah, no, the experiments I'm referring to control for novelty. I will send you the reference after our talk, but I don't want to get distracted into that particular empirical question. I was making the broader point there that affective responses are not evoked only by interoceptive stimuli. They're evoked also by... No, I know, I'm agreeing with you.
Yeah, I wouldn't even say that I wouldn't say even that affect is evoked by in any interoceptive stimuli. I mean, I would say that, to use Bud Craig's phrasing, I would say affect is a re-representation of interoception. Or if you look at the architecture, for example, of the cerebral cortex, or you look at the architecture of the brainstem up to the cortex, the ascending pathways, what you see is there are compression gradients. So you can take, what they do is they take a lot of detailed signals and compress them into lower dimensional summaries. That's what I think affect is. It's a compression. It's a lower dimensional representation, not that one thing is triggering another. But
you were asking me what I think affect is, and I'm still trying to spell that out. So what I'm saying is, it's affect is the representation in the valence and the arousal and quality, the categorical quality of a deviation from homeostatic bounds.
Right,
So
but I'm
the
asking you in the brain,
and
what causes it? What causes it in the brain? Where is it? How is it computed in a brain?
Let me just finish the point before I get to that. And that those homeostats are not, they're not measuring only interoceptive, but also exteroceptive stimuli. So I don't think that affect is uniquely tied to interoception, although obviously, given that we're talking about survival imperatives, the preferred states of the organism, its interoceptive state tells you a great deal about whether or not it's about to deviate from its viable bounds, but so do certain extraceptive stimuli. That's why I referred to snakes and spiders. You could say the same about fright. You could say the same about noxious substances. You could say the same about a painful external stimulus to the skin. So these are all these sensory data are computed as, does this mean that I'm moving into closer to or further away from my viable bounds? That's what valence is, and it's necessary for it to pertain to a particular category of need. That is the individual homeostat that we are talking about. So you asked me, where is that computed? It's computed mainly in the hypothalamus, but also in several other subcortical structures, like, for example, the parabrachial complex, the area postrema, the nucleus solitaris, various circumventricular organs, and all of this is hugely importantly orchestrated by periaqueductal gray, which acts as a sort of a meta-homeostat, not the meta-homeostat, but a meta-homeostat, sort of setting precision levels in relation to the various prediction errors in relation to the various homeostats. So homeostats are endogenous intrinsic properties. They don't relate uniquely to interoception or exteroception. What they relate to is the preferred states, the viable bounds of your phenotype. And so now to come to the crucial point is one such homeostat is a nociceptive homeostat. And there are others for the other bodily needs I spoke of earlier, like things like hydration, glucose supplies, sleep, and so on. And I'm saying that they are categorical variables because you have to meet each of those needs in their own right. You can't just, on average, I'm reducing my free energy, is not going to do it. You have to reduce your free energy in relation to each of those categories because we are complex organisms and all those needs have to be met. So that's where the feeling comes from. Mm-hmm. And then it's a matter of, I feel like this, that's affect. About that is perceptions. And those perceptions can be interoceptive or exteroceptive. The categories are initially innate, but then they become greatly broadened as we learn from experience. But I want to lastly say again, please, I still haven't got an answer to the question. In terms of the broadened concept of affect that you seem to be open to, do you agree that there are innate qualities of affect? Like, for example, do babies feel pain as pain without having learned anything? That's an intrinsic, naturally selected, given category, which comes with a particular quale, which is not the same as valence, and it's not the same as arousal because it's a particular type of unpleasure, pain.
So I think the answer that you want from me for the question that you're asking is making certain assumptions I don't agree with. So let me just say, first of all, that just as a sort of side point, nociception, according to Bud Craig, is a form of interoception. He's talking about interoception he's not defining things but in terms of what is felt. He's defining things in terms of the evolution and development of particular tracts in the spinal cord. So just just to make that point that I don't, for us, I think it's not really relevant whether or not nociception is interoception or not, but there are certain forms of nociception which are like visceral nociception, for example, and there's certain types of nociceptive signals that are carried by small diameter neurons, which are considered interoceptive in their origin, as opposed to the large diameter somatosensory neurons. So that's just an aside that there are other ways other than feeling to define what boundaries are. So I don't really hold to a strong, I think I'm more like Gary Bernstein and my colleague Karen Quigley, that I don't think there's a firm distinction between interoception and exteroception, but I just did want to make that point. And the other point about nociception is that, so there are many, many, many cases where people feel pain when there is no ascending nociceptive signal. That's chronic pain. And there are also cases where there is tissue damage and there are nociceptive signals and people do not feel pain. So I just also want to put that out there, that there's no, and the International Association for the Study of Pain defines pain as an emotion. They actually, it's conceptualized signals. The nociceptive signals have to be made meaningful. This is their language. I mean, it's right on their website. So I just want to make that point too. But what I said was that the fact that there is, the fact that I say that there's comfort and discomfort, there's pleasure and displeasure, if pleasure and displeasure are valence or comfort, discomfort are low dimensional compressed summaries, that means they can refer to many different sensory motor patterns. So you could be feeling very, very unpleasant because there is a nociceptive change. And you could be feeling very, very unpleasant for some other, where there's no nociceptive change, but there are changes in, your glucose levels or your water levels or whatever. Like, for example, people when they're dehydrated don't always feel thirsty. Sometimes they feel fatigued. So my point here is that, feeling fatigued even is a compressed multimodal summary that can refer to many different sensory motor patterns. So can an infant feel pain? Sure, an infant can feel pain. An infant doesn't have to be taught to feel pain. But that they're feeling pain, that doesn't mean that pain is different from unpleasantness. It's just, it could be really, really, really intense distress and unpleasantness. So the fact that valence and arousal there are many different ways to feel unpleasant. There are many different ways to feel aroused. Arousal and valence are not, I think of them as compressed summaries that can refer to many different patterns of sensory motor signal, which is why in the brain, you can't point to a place and say, well, that's where valence is, because the patterns are variable. The signals are variable. So I would say an infant can feel intense discomfort as pain. They can feel pain, but I don't think that supports your view that pain is a distinct, has a distinct qualia from, right? So there's some suggestion that, what we experience as distress, as intense distress, is visceral sense. It's like viscerosensory nociception. It's nociception that comes from the viscera, from your gut, from the insides of your body, rather than, your skin, pricking something on your skin, or, or a bone breaking or what have you. So I don't think that I don't think there's a one-to-one correspondence between the qualia, as you would say, that people experience and the biological signals that are occurring under the hood. And I also think there's evidence, there's really good evidence that these qualia are continuous, they're not discrete. And so it's not that I believe this, I believe it because that's what the data show. And if you could show me evidence otherwise, then I would probably change my view. So I also think that, so how do you understand that that people can be, when people are dehydrated, they feel tired? How do you understand that in Bali people fall asleep when they're afraid? Like, how do you understand these examples, or where, or the fact that if there really were discrete qualia, then you would expect that maybe not every language would have discrete boundaries, words that refer to that are used in a way that, or words that refer to concepts that are discrete. But you would expect some cultures to have it, maybe even most cultures. And there was a recent study published in Science where they looked at something like 2,500 languages and looked for the evidence of discrete, using lexical analyses. They looked for evidence of discrete boundaries and couldn't actually find, I think something like only 20% of the, I have the statistics here somewhere, but something like.
It doesn't matter, I accept it.
Yeah. Or how would you understand when you, like, for example, the PAG, for example, I mean, we have evidence that, certain columns in the PAG, this is using 7 Tesla imaging, so where you can see brainstem and midbrain regions very, very, very well, almost like an X-ray, that you see changes in PAG activity just from like doing an N-back, like a 1-back memory. It's like remembering a phone number, or the electrical stimulation studies, which show that the stimulation of a particular set of neurons produces a whole wide-ranging set of qualia, not specific categories. So I'm curious how do you understand that, all of that evidence?
Okay. So, gosh, I have to go back quite a way to the beginning of what you've said in this segment. First of all, when you were talking about Bud Craig, I want to just make sure that our viewers understand that about nociception, pain, there are interoceptive and extraceptive varieties of pain, in my view. I'm not saying that pain is uniquely extraceptive by any means. In fact, the example we started with of appendicitis is clearly not extraceptive. It's something to do with the visceral body. But the pain, we are just using it as an example. I'm saying that, for example, do babies feel pain?
No, I know. I'll just, sorry to clarify. I think the reason, what made me think of it was you said, like, I prick my finger on my skin.
Yeah.
Bud Craig's skin, if you look at the underlying origin of the circuitry, skin he would consider interoceptive, because the neurons, the axons that are carrying that information are small diameter. And so by his classification scheme, which is based on the origin and the anatomy of the neurons, he would classify that. That was That was,
yeah. So I think that point is moot, whether all C fibers are interoceptive based on some sort of evolutionary story. But that's really not the point. The point is that that there are innate categories of affect. This is the point I'm trying to make, which are felt qualitatively distinctively. One is pain, which in my view can be extraceptive or interoceptive. Remember, the homeostats are endogenous. They don't relate to uniquely interoception or extraception. I was just saying there are also extraceptive sources of affect, and the stimuli don't have to be interoceptive alone. Fright is extraceptive. Disgust, you put something in the mouth that's got to do with taste and smell. These are extraceptive modalities. As pain in neurology has always been classed among the different subcategories of somatosensory perception. So that's not the point. The point is that there are these different things: sleepiness, pain, coldness, fright. And I'm saying that we are born with these innate categories. Now you're saying, well, what's the evidence for that? You can only have behavioral evidence, unfortunately, when it comes. I mean, it's very telling that we get the same sorts of responses to the same sorts of stimuli in all human babies and also in other mammals. So this is the whole sort of argument about what is universal, but it's based on behavior. This is unfortunately, we spoke earlier of the fundamental properties of affect. We said that they're valenced, that they modulate arousal, and I'm adding that they have distinct affective categories of qualia. But the other thing about them is they're subjective. There's no getting around the fact that affects are subjective states. They're states of the subject. I feel like this about the object. Therefore, we have a huge methodological, epistemological problem, and this is another source of the apparent disagreements between you and me, is that, you very harsh on using behavioral data. You speak of the mental inference fallacy or something of that kind, but it's all we've got when it comes to pre-verbal infants and non-verbal animals. Yeah, we can only go on the behavior and the fact that the reliability of the observations across species. But let me just finish answering the points that you've made. So you ask about, so I'm saying it makes evolutionary sense. It makes the behavioral evidence speaks to it. I don't understand why it would not be the case that the baby doesn't just feel unpleasure. It feels unpleasure of a particular kind, that's sleepiness, pain, thirst, it's coldness. These are different things. Now, it's not only that there is a particular quality of feeling, there is also the non-specific factors that you referred to. You said there's no place that you can locate valence in the brain, and I absolutely agree with you, because it's a property that cuts across all of these different categories of affect. The same applies to arousal. So there are non-specific aspects. In other words, there's some overlap between these different categories. The categorical part has to do with the qualia. The continuous part has to do with the valence, and the other continuous part has to do with the arousal. And so they do overlap with each other. There is a general unpleasure that the baby feels, but then there also are categories of it. There's a general arousal modulation aspect, but then it's in response to or in relation to different categories of feeling. There's also, even at the level of the innate categories, there are overlaps. Like, for example, the circuitry for pain has very interesting overlaps with circuitry for separation distress. And I'm sure you're very much aware of all of that literature. So the pain of separation and loss in mammals and birds is a overlapping variable with physical pain, and the chemistry of it speaks to that. And this is another very important. I'm going to say two more things. This is another very important part of the evidence that you're asking for about natural kinds, that there are drugs, like opiates, which in your book, you mention how we share opioid receptors with some extremely primitive, simple nervous systems. These are by no means uniquely human or mammalian things. But opiate drugs like morphine, they relieve pain, at least as far as the behavior is concerned, in all of those creatures. So if it wasn't a natural kind, how come the same chemical does the same thing in all of them? We feel it as pain relief, and we can report it once we become verbal creatures. But if we're going to limit ourselves only to reportability, then we're going to have to leave out the vast bulk of the evidence for the view that I'm arguing for. And I mentioned opioid receptors there. The same could be said about a great many others. I mean, dopamine agonists, anxiolytics, etc., sedatives. Speaking of sleep, they do the same thing in all of us. And so I think that is further evidence, the pharmacological and chemical specificities, the categorical nature of those, and the innate and cross-species properties of those is another bit of evidence for there being natural kinds of affect. Now you ask, how do I explain these phenomena in relation to chronic pain and cultural differences in terms of how one responds to fear and so on? That simply speaks again to the point that I made earlier, that we start with these natural kinds. These are very simple things, and these are simple given concepts with attendant given predictions, which are our reflexes and instincts, but they are not enough. And therefore, we have to elaborate them in all sorts of ways, and we elaborate them in idiosyncratic ways, we elaborate them in culturally specific ways, and it's that elaboration that I think your work is all about. And I said in my book, I don't think there's such a big disagreement between you and me, because everything that you say, I agree, happens. The disagreement only has to do with where does it start from? And that's why I think the most important thing in the conversation that you and I are having today is this question about, do babies feel pain? Do babies feel cold? Do babies get frights? And are they qualitatively distinctive from each other, or are they all just states of arousal and unpleasure? It looks like we're going to have to end on that.
So we're not going to end on that. We're actually, I'm going to beg your indulgence for 3 minutes because I have something.
Please have the last word. Do, Lisa.
So I don't think that we have epistemological problems. I think we have ontological problems. And let me explain why. You've characterized my work, as have others, as having an over-reliance on subjective report, which I actually think is unfair, because I've published 270 peer-reviewed papers, and I don't even know, but certainly not even half of them are about self-report. But in any case, here's my point. I agree with you that there are problems with only relying on subjective reports, for sure. The subjective reports don't support natural kinds by the definitions of natural kinds, which is that there are firm boundaries that that you can make.
Yeah, I agree. That's in socialized, enculturated, learned.
That's why there's a difference between evidence which is consistent with a hypothesis and evidence which actually supports it, because consistent can be caused by other, the evidence can be actually caused by other means. But here's the thing I want to point out. You say that I'm hostile to behavior. I'm not hostile to behavior. I think you have to use behavior. You have to use self-report. You have to use many things altogether. But behavior is not objective, meaning when you look at a rat doing something, you are making an inference. You don't have sensory surfaces for these homeostats. You don't have sensory surfaces for emotion. You have sensory surfaces for light and sound and so on. You observe behaviors in animals and you make an inference. It's your subjective inference. And if you and another scientist agree with each other that this behavior is fear, or this behavior is seeking, or this behavior is care or whatever, then you both have consensus of your subjective experiences. So to some extent, and this is a point that I've made before in conversation with Ralph Adolphs, who I think is probably the only other scientist like you who's been willing to have these kind of conversations with me. The point that I made, and that I'll make again, is that somehow you're prioritizing your subjective perceptions of how to make sense of those behaviors, but it's exactly the same problem that you point out with the problem of subjective report, and that is you're observing actions in animals and you are making an inference about what they mean. Now, you might say, well, but I'm making that inference based on other evidence like these homeostats, and you can show me the circuitry for these homeostats. But here's the thing about that circuitry. You've drawn the boundaries. You've drawn the boundaries because nobody has ever discovered chemically, anatomically, anything, precise boundaries in circuitry. They're basically, it's just like in systems theory. You as the scientist decide what's in the system and what's outside the system. When I first started learning neuroscience, I would ask anatomists and biochemists. So when one neuron is modulating, one neuron is synapsing on another, are they both in the same circuit, or is that one circuit modulating another circuit? Like, how do you know? And the answer is you don't. There's no objective way to know. You've drawn those. So my point here is that you're looking for categories. I'm not saying that's wrong, but you are looking for categories. It's your inference that those categories are there. It's your inference that those categories are there at the level of the circuitry, and it's your inference that those categories are there in behavior. And I'm not saying that it's bad that there's an inference, but what I'm saying is it's an inference, just like it's subjective, just like a person's report is an inference, it's subjective. And that's my point. My point is
it's a good point, Lisa. So let's end there because I'm worrying about, I've got another appointment. We clearly need to talk some more. Yeah. If I can just say one last thing in response to what you've just said, which I accept, I totally accept it. I just want to point out that the same applies to other natural kinds that you do seem to accept. You like speak what? Of an interoceptive network, a default mode network, a control network.
I never said those.
You speak also of survival circuits.
No, I don't actually. So let me just be really clear. I never said they were natural kinds ever. And in fact, in my book, I make it really clear they're not natural kinds. In fact, I believe in chapter 4.
Good. Well, then we agree.
No, in fact.
Okay. Look, we must continue this conversation. Let's over the emails arrange it. Yeah. But okay, thank you very much for this great start. Thanks, Lisa.
Okay. Take care.
Cheers. Bye-bye.
Bye.